I trusted the pills because I trusted him. That is the part people don't understand. It wasn't blind faith, it was familiarity. The kind that grows quietly when you share a bed, a routine, a life that looks ordinary from the outside. Every night after dinner, after the dishes were done and the lights were dimmed, he would place the pills in my palm like a small act of care. 2 white ones, sometimes 3, always with a glass of water already filled. Always with that same calm voice saying they were for my sleep, for my nerves, for my health. He said my body needed rest. He said my mind worked too much. He said doctors recommend these things for women like me. Women like me, tired, emotional, sensitive. At first, I didn't question it. Why would I? I was his wife. We had been married long enough that questioning felt rude, ungrateful. Love teaches you that doubting is a kind of betrayal, so I swallowed the pills and lay down beside him. And the sleep came fast. Too fast, maybe, but I told myself that was relief. That was what rest felt like after years of carrying too much. But then the mornings started to feel wrong. I would wake up with a heavy head like my thoughts were wrapped in cotton. Time felt slippery. Conversations from the night before were gone, not forgotten, just missing. Sometimes my body felt sore in places I couldn't explain. Sometimes I noticed small things out of place. A chair moved, a door unlocked. My phone not where I left it. He would already be awake, dressed, watching me wake up with that same calm face. "Did you sleep well?" he would ask. I always said yes. Even when I wasn't sure. The shock didn't come all at once. It never does. It came in fragments. In instincts I pushed down because they sounded dramatic. In moments where my chest tightened for no clear reason. In the way he insisted on handing me the pills himself, never letting me take them on my own. In the way he watched my mouth until I swallowed, his eyes steady, patient. I started noticing how deeply I slept. Not normal sleep, not dreams. It was like falling into a hole, like being switched off. I would close my eyes and disappear, and hours later return feeling like I had skipped something important, like my life was happening without me. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was tired. That marriage does this to women. That aging does this. Society is very good at teaching women to doubt their own awareness, but fear has a sound. It's quiet, but it doesn't stop. One night, lying there before the pills touched my tongue, I felt it clearly for the first time. A warning, sharp and undeniable. My hand trembled slightly, and I hid it by reaching for the water. He noticed everything. He always did. He smiled and told me to relax, told me I worried too much, told me he was only trying to help. That was the night I realized how much power trust gives someone. The pills became a symbol, small, innocent-looking, something you wouldn't think twice about, and that was what made it terrifying. There were no bruises, no shouting, no obvious violence, just a nightly ritual wrapped in care. Control disguised as concern. I began to notice how isolated I felt, how my world had quietly shrunk. Friends I hadn't seen in months. Family calls he said I could return later. How tired I always was, too tired to question, too tired to resist, too tired to stay awake. The shock wasn't just the possibility that something was wrong. It was the realization that if something was wrong, it was happening in the one place I was supposed to be safe. In my bed, beside the man who knew my habits, my fears, my sleep. I remember sitting on the edge of the bed one evening, pills resting in my palm, and feeling like I was holding more than medicine. I felt like I was holding a choice I didn't know how to name yet. My heart was beating too fast for a quiet night. My body knew before my mind was ready. That was when I understood that whatever was happening, it wasn't accidental. The routine was too perfect. The timing too exact. The way he never forgot, never missed a night. The way he became irritated if I hesitated. The way he reassured me with words that felt rehearsed. I started counting the hours between swallowing and losing consciousness. I started noticing how quickly my limbs grew heavy, how my thoughts blurred at the edges, how resistance felt impossible once the pills dissolved. And still, I swallowed them. Because fear doesn't always make you brave right away. Sometimes it makes you quiet. Sometimes it makes you play along until you understand the rules of the danger you're in. The shock settled into my bones slowly, not as panic, but as awareness. Something was being done to me, night after night, intentionally, carefully. And whoever was doing it knew exactly how much trust it would take to make me cooperate. Lying beside him in the dark, listening to his breathing, I realized that monsters don't always look like strangers. Sometimes they look like husbands. Sometimes they bring you water. Sometimes they kiss your forehead and tell you to sleep. The suspicion did not arrive like an alarm. It arrived like a fog. Slow, soft, almost polite. It didn't demand attention. It waited. It settled into the corners of my days and nights until it became part of the air I was breathing. At first, it lived in my body before it ever reached my thoughts. A strange heaviness in my limbs when I woke up, as if gravity had increased overnight. My hands would tremble slightly when I tried to hold my cup of tea. My mouth felt dry no matter how much water I drank. There were mornings when my reflection looked unfamiliar, not because I looked different, but because my eyes seemed dull, like they were still half asleep even when the rest of me was standing upright. I told myself it was stress. Women are taught that explanation early. Stress explains everything. Stress explains exhaustion, confusion, sadness, forgetfulness. Stress explains why you don't remember what you said last night or why your head feels thick and slow in the morning. Stress is a convenient word. Absolves everyone else. But stress doesn't erase time. There were gaps, small at first, conversations I couldn't recall finishing, decisions I didn't remember making. I would find messages on my phone that I didn't remember sending. Short replies, polite ones, written in my tone but not in my awareness. I would stare at the screen, trying to summon the moment when my fingers typed those words and nothing would come. When I asked him about it, casually, lightly, as if I were joking, he would smile. He always smiled. He said I worried too much. He said I had always been forgetful. He reminded me of times, years ago, when I misplaced my keys or forgot an appointment. He stacked those memories carefully, building a case against my instincts. Gaslighting doesn't feel like fire. It feels like being gently redirected again and again until you no longer trust your sense of direction. I began to notice how closely he watched me, not in an obvious way, not with suspicion. With attentiveness, the kind that looks like care if you don't question it, his eyes followed me when I walked across the room. He noticed when I hesitated before taking the pills. He noticed when I asked questions that didn't fit the script. "You're overthinking," he would say. "You need rest. Just take them, you'll feel better." His voice was calm, always calm. Calm is powerful. Calm makes you feel unreasonable for being afraid. The nights became the hardest. Not because of what I knew, but because of what I didn't. I would lie in bed, waiting for the pills to take effect and try to stay present for as long as possible. I counted breaths. I focused on the feel of the sheets against my skin. I tried to anchor myself in the moment before it slipped away, and it always slipped away. There is a particular kind of fear that comes from losing consciousness against your will. Even if your body is the one swallowing the pills, something inside you resists. My thoughts would blur at the edges first. Then my limbs would feel distant, like they belonged to someone else. Sometimes I could hear him moving around after I should have been asleep. Footsteps, drawers opening, the faint sound of his phone, and then nothing. Morning would arrive like a stranger. I began to wake up with small aches that didn't belong to sleep. A soreness in my wrists, a stiffness in my neck. Once, a faint bruise on my arm that I couldn't explain. When I asked about it, he laughed gently and said I must have bumped into something. He said I was clumsy when I was tired. I stopped asking. Silence becomes a survival skill when questions are met with dismissal. I noticed how isolated I had become. It didn't happen suddenly. It happened through a series of reasonable decisions. I was too tired to go out, too foggy to talk on the phone, too drained to explain why I couldn't remember things. He would offer to cancel plans for me, to answer messages on my behalf, to tell people I wasn't feeling well. At first, it felt helpful. Then it felt necessary. Then it felt normal. That is how control works when it is patient. My world grew smaller, quieter. The outside voices faded. His became the loudest, then the only one. He told me what day it was, what time it was, what I had agreed to, what was good for me. He never raised his voice. He never rushed. He acted like someone burdened by responsibility. I began to doubt my own mind. That was the most frightening part. Not the pills, not the sleep. The doubt. I would catch myself thinking, maybe I really am unwell. Maybe I need this. Maybe without him, I wouldn't function at all. Those thoughts did not feel forced. They felt logical. They slid into place so easily that I didn't notice how dangerous they were. But the body keeps records the mind tries to erase. There were moments, brief and sharp, when clarity pierced the fog. Moments when my heart would start racing for no visible reason. Moments when the smell of the pills made my stomach tight. Moments when his hand on my shoulder felt heavier than it should. One night, I watched him crush a pill slightly before handing it to me. Just a small motion. Almost nothing. When I asked why, he said it would help it dissolve faster. He said doctors recommend it for people who have trouble sleeping deeply. Deeply. That word stayed with me. I began to pay attention in secret. I watched how he stored the medication, how careful he was with it, how he never left it where I could access it myself. how the labels were vague, how the prescriptions never seemed to run out. I noticed how he discouraged me from seeing doctors alone. He insisted on coming with me. He spoke for me. He described my symptoms before I could. He framed everything as anxiety, insomnia, emotional sensitivity. The doctors nodded. They trusted him. He was calm. He was articulate. He was the husband. I was the tired woman. There were days when I felt like I was disappearing in plain sight, like my identity was thinning, becoming porous. I would start a sentence and forget how it ended. I would stand in a room and forget why I was there. I would feel emotions without knowing their cause. And through all of it, he remained steady, supportive, present. That contrast made me feel ungrateful for my fear. I began to keep small mental notes. I couldn't write anything down. He checked my things. So I memorized the color of the pills, the timing, the way my body reacted, the way his mood shifted if I hesitated. Fear sharpened my attention. There were nights when I wanted to scream, not because I knew what was happening, but because I didn't. Uncertainty is its own form of torture, not knowing whether you are in danger or imagining danger where there is none. I tested myself in small ways. I delayed taking the pills by a few minutes. I pretended to drop one and asked for another. Each time his response was immediate, controlled, watchful. The room felt tighter when I resisted, even gently. I began to realize that whatever was happening depended on my compliance. That thought was terrifying. The suspicion grew heavier, darker. It followed me through the day. It sat beside me while I ate. It lay down with me at night. It didn't scream. It whispered, "Something is wrong. Something is being done to you. Something you did not agree to." I didn't yet have proof. I didn't have language. I didn't even fully trust myself. But the feeling would not leave. It pressed against my ribs, against my throat, against my sleep. I started to understand that danger doesn't always announce itself with violence. Sometimes it arrives with routine, with tenderness, with medicine cups and concern. The decision did not come to me in a moment of courage. It came to me in exhaustion. In that space where fear and clarity finally touch, I did not wake up one morning brave. I woke up tired of disappearing. By then, suspicion was no longer a shadow. It had weight. It followed me from room to room. It sat in my chest like something unfinished. Every night when he brought the pills, my body reacted before my mind could interfere. My stomach tightened. My pulse quickened. My throat felt narrower, as if it already knew it was about to betray me again. I began to dread the evenings. Not because of him speaking or touching or even the pills themselves, but because of the moment just before. That quiet space where I still belonged to myself. That moment where I was awake, aware, present. I had started to notice how much effort it took to stay there. Fear has a way of making time feel uneven. The nights stretched long, but the moments before sleep felt painfully short. I would sit on the bed, pretending to be calm, listening to him move around the room and count the seconds I had left before my thoughts dissolved. I didn't know what would happen if I stayed awake. I didn't know what I would see. I only knew that every night I swallowed those pills, something was being taken from me, and I needed to know what it was. The idea of pretending came quietly. Not as a plan, but as a question. What if I didn't swallow them? What if just once I stayed? The thought scared me more than the pills ever had, because pretending meant crossing a line. It meant admitting, even if only to myself, that I believed he was capable of harming me. And that belief carried consequences I wasn't ready to face. For days, I did nothing. I thought about it and then pushed the thought away. I told myself I was being dramatic. I told myself that suspicion was dangerous too. That imagining harm could destroy a marriage just as surely as harm itself. But my body didn't care about those arguments. My body knew something my mind was still negotiating. I practiced in silence. I imagined the motion of hiding the pill under my tongue, the angle of my head when I drank water, the timing, the swallowing sound. I rehearsed it like a performance, not because I wanted to deceive him, but because I needed to survive the deception. I watched him more closely than ever. I studied his routines, his habits, his pauses. I noticed how he always waited until he was sure I had swallowed, how he never turned away until the glass was empty, how his eyes stayed on my face, not affectionate, not loving, but focused. That focus told me everything I needed to know. The night I decided to pretend, nothing felt dramatic. There was no storm outside, no argument, no raised voices. Dinner passed as it always did. He spoke about his day. I nodded. I smiled at the right moments. I played my role carefully because by then I understood that my safety depended on how convincing I was. When he brought the pills, my hands were steady in a way that surprised me. My heart was pounding, but my fingers did not shake. Fear sharpens you when there is no room for error. He placed the pills in my palm, just like always. White, smooth, innocent looking. I remember thinking how small they were, how something so small had taken over my life. I raised them to my mouth. This was the point of no return. If I hesitated, he would notice. If I questioned, he would redirect. If I refused, I didn't know what would happen next, so I did exactly what I had practiced. I tilted my head back. I placed the pills on my tongue. I drank the water slowly, deliberately, letting it wash over them while keeping them hidden. I swallowed in stages, controlling my throat, forcing the sound. I lowered the glass and met his eyes. He watched me closely. For a moment that felt endless, he didn't move. Then he smiled, not wide, not warm, just enough. "Good," he said. "Now get some rest." That word again, rest, as if what he was giving me was kindness. I lay down beside him, my heart racing so loudly I was sure he could hear it. The pill was still there, bitter against my tongue, a reminder of the danger sitting between my teeth. I waited until his breathing changed, until the room settled into its nighttime rhythm. I did not spit the pill out right away. I was afraid of the sound, afraid of the movement, afraid of everything. When I finally did, I wrapped it carefully in a tissue and hid it where I had already planned. That small act felt heavier than anything I had done in years. It was proof that I had crossed from suspicion into action. Then came the hardest part, staying awake. My body was trained to surrender. Night after night, it had learned that resistance was pointless. Even without the pills, my muscles felt heavy. My eyelids drooped. My thoughts blurred from habit alone. I fought it quietly. I focused on details, the sound of his breathing, the hum of the refrigerator in the other room, the way the sheets felt against my skin. I counted breaths again. I counted seconds. I told myself over and over that I needed to see. Time moved strangely. Minutes stretched, then collapsed. My body begged me to sleep, but fear held me upright. Fear and something else I hadn't felt in a long time. Control. I don't know how long passed before he moved. At first, it was small. A shift in the bed, a change in his breathing. I stayed still, pretending. My heart slammed against my ribs, but I forced my face into the slack expression I knew he expected. He sat up slowly. Carefully, as if even sound might wake me. I kept my breathing even. I let my mouth fall slightly open. I gave him the version of me he thought he owned. The room felt different then. Charged, every movement louder, sharper. I became aware of how vulnerable I was, lying there, eyes closed, pretending to be gone. He stood. He watched me. I felt his gaze like a weight on my skin. I wanted to flinch. I didn't. That was when I understood how much trust he had in the pills. He didn't check my eyes. He didn't touch my shoulder. He believed I was unconscious because he believed in what he had been doing to me. That realization was colder than fear. I listened as he moved around the room, drawers opening, his phone lighting up, a whisper of fabric. Every sound etched itself into my memory. I told myself I would not forget this, that I could not afford to forget this. My mind raced, but my body stayed still. I felt like I was split in two. One part of me lying there, silent, compliant. The other watching everything, recording, surviving. This was no longer about curiosity. It was about confirmation. The act of pretending changed something inside me. Even before I knew exactly what I was witnessing, I understood that I was no longer passive. I was no longer just enduring. I was observing, gathering, preparing. Fear didn't disappear. It intensified, but it became useful. As I lay there, awake in the dark, I realized how dangerous it had been to trust without question, how easily love could be turned into leverage, how quietly harm could enter a life without ever raising its voice. The pill hidden away, my eyes closed, my mind wide open, I stayed exactly where he expected me to be, listening, watching, waiting, holding my breath not just for what I would see next, but for the version of myself that would never again swallow anything without knowing why. The first thing I learned that night was how different the room feels when you are awake in it without permission. Familiar walls take on edges. Shadows stop being decorative. Every sound grows in tension. I lay there with my eyes closed, my body still, and realized how often I had mistaken routine for safety. He didn't rush. That was the most unsettling part. There was no urgency in his movements, no panic, no mess. He moved like someone following a script he had rehearsed many times. The bed shifted slightly as he stood. I felt the air change when his weight left the mattress. My breathing stayed slow, deliberate, not too deep, not too shallow. I became acutely aware of how breathing itself could give me away. He stood there for a moment, just watching. I could feel it. That pause told me more than anything else. It wasn't concern. It wasn't checking. It was confirmation. He was making sure the pills had done what they were meant to do. and because he believed they had, he trusted the stillness of my body more than he ever trusted my words. He moved toward the dresser. I heard the soft scrape of wood, the familiar drawer that I had opened 1,000 times without thinking. But now, every sound felt like a confession. He opened it slowly, carefully, as if the night itself were fragile. I listened to him take something out, place something else back. I could not see it, but I could hear the order in his movements. Whatever he was doing, he did it often. Then there was his phone. The faint click of the screen lighting up. The way he lowered his voice, not because he was worried about waking me, but because secrecy had become a habit. He didn't whisper my name. He didn't say anything about me at all. That absence was loud. I heard him step away from the bed. The floor creaked softly under his feet, a sound I had lived with for years. But now it felt like an intruder's footsteps in my own home. I counted them. 1, 2, 3. He stopped near the door. My mind raced with possibilities. I didn't know what I was about to witness, only that whatever it was, it required me not to be conscious. That knowledge pressed against my chest until it was hard to breathe. I reminded myself to stay still, to stay invisible. The door opened quietly. He didn't turn on the light. He didn't need to. He knew the layout. He knew where everything was. That familiarity, once comforting, now felt like a weapon. I listened as he moved through the apartment, opening another door, closing it again. I heard water running briefly, then stopping. I heard him return. He stood near the bed again, closer this time, so close that I could smell him. That moment stretched. I felt exposed in a way I never had before. Not because he touched me, but because I understood that my body, unconscious or not, had been something he felt entitled to manage. He checked my phone. I knew because I heard the slight movement, the familiar sound of it being lifted. My stomach tightened. That phone held pieces of me I hadn't even realized I was protecting. Messages, missed calls, small signs of a world beyond him. He scrolled slowly, patiently, as if time belonged to him. Then he put it back exactly where it had been. That detail broke something inside me, the precision, the care. He wasn't reacting, he was maintaining. I realized then that whatever was happening wasn't impulsive. It wasn't driven by anger or jealousy or fear of the moment. It was planned, sustained. Thought through, the pills were not a solution to a problem. They were the foundation of a system. He sat on the edge of the bed. I felt the mattress dip. My body screamed at me to move, to flinch, to breathe differently. I did none of those things. I stayed exactly as I had been trained to stay. He touched my arm lightly, not to wake me, to test me. His fingers pressed just enough to see if there would be a response. When there wasn't, he relaxed. That relaxation terrified me more than force ever could. He withdrew his hand and stood again. I heard him open the closet. The sound of hangers shifting, fabric sliding. He was looking for something or checking something. I didn't know which was worse. Every movement felt like a piece of a puzzle I didn't want to complete. At some point, he left the room again. Longer this time. I listened to the apartment exist without him near me. The hum of electricity. The distant sound of traffic outside. The refrigerator cycling on and off. All the normal things that had always been there unnoticed suddenly felt like witnesses. When he returned, his movements were different. Quicker, more purposeful. He checked the time on his phone. He looked at me again. He nodded slightly as if confirming something to himself. That nod changed everything. It told me he was measuring, timing, monitoring effects. This wasn't about whether I slept. It was about how deeply, how completely, how unreachable. I felt a surge of anger then, sharp and sudden. Not loud, not explosive. Cold, focused. I wanted to open my eyes. I wanted to scream his name. I wanted to shatter the calm he relied on. But I didn't. Because anger without preparation is dangerous. I let him believe I was gone. He returned to his side of the bed eventually. Lay down. His breathing settled. The room returned to stillness, but it was a different kind now. Charged, unforgiving. I lay there, eyes still closed, my body aching from the effort of restraint, my mind replaying every sound, every movement, every confirmation. The revelation wasn't a single image or action. It was the pattern, the ease, the absence of hesitation. The way he operated with confidence because he believed I was incapable of witnessing him. That belief was the betrayal. I understood then that the pills were not about helping me sleep. They were about removing my agency, about ensuring my silence. About creating a version of me that could not interrupt whatever he needed to do. I didn't know everything yet. I didn't have all the answers, but I knew enough. Enough to stop doubting myself. Enough to understand that what I had feared was not an exaggeration. The man I slept beside was not unaware. He was intentional. I stayed awake for a long time after that, long after his breathing deepened. long after the night moved toward morning. I stared into the darkness behind my eyelids and felt something settle into place. Not peace, not relief, clarity. The horror did not come from what I saw, it came from what I understood. That difference matters. Seeing can shock you, but understanding changes how you breathe, how you sit in your own body, how you remember every moment that came before. Once the clarity settled in, it did not leave. It followed me into the morning light, into the kitchen, into the sound of his voice when he asked if I had slept well. I looked at him and realized that I was standing inside a carefully built lie, one that had been assembled slowly, patiently, with my trust as its foundation. The most terrifying part was how normal everything still looked. The apartment was the same. The table, the cups, the quiet rhythm of our routine. He moved through the space like a man who had nothing to hide. That ease was unbearable. It told me this wasn't a mistake or a lapse or a moment of weakness. It was a system, and I had been living inside it without knowing the rules. Psychological horror does not scream. It whispers until you start questioning your own thoughts. I began to replay the past not as memories, but as evidence. Nights I had lost, decisions I couldn't recall agreeing to, changes in myself that I had blamed on age, on stress, on weakness. I saw now how neatly responsibility had been shifted onto me. You're tired, you're anxious, you forget things. He had said those words with concern, with patience, with the authority of someone who appeared reasonable. And I had believed him because believing him was easier than facing the alternative. The realization that someone you love has been shaping your reality is a unique kind of terror. It doesn't feel like betrayal right away. It feels like vertigo. Like the ground beneath your life has tilted and you are trying to stay upright without letting anyone see you stumble. I started noticing how often he spoke for me, how he corrected me gently when I remembered something differently, how he framed my reactions as emotional rather than rational. He never raised his voice. He never forced me physically. He didn't need to. He had already taught me to doubt myself. That is the cruelty of psychological control. It doesn't break you loudly. It convinces you that you are already broken. Every interaction became layered. Words carried double meanings. Kindness felt strategic. Even silence felt calculated. I found myself studying him the way one studies a locked door, searching for weaknesses, for signs, for patterns. And the patterns were everywhere once I knew how to see them. The pills were only the most obvious tool. There were others. The isolation disguised as protection. The concern that discouraged independence. The way he positioned himself as the only stable thing in my life. He didn't need to lock me in. He made the outside world feel inaccessible. I thought about how often I had apologized for things that weren't my fault. How often I had accepted blame just to keep the peace. How often I had thanked him for helping me manage my own life. That gratitude haunted me. Psychological horror is realizing that your compliance was engineered, that your silence was not a choice you freely made, but a behavior cultivated over time, that you were trained, gently, to disappear. I started to feel watched even when he wasn't in the room. That is what control does when it sinks deep enough. You internalize it, you monitor yourself, you adjust before you are corrected, you become your own guard. There were moments when panic threatened to surface, but I swallowed it back down. Panic is loud. Panic makes mistakes. What I needed now was composure. I played my role carefully. I smiled when expected. I thanked him. I took the pills on schedule or appeared to. Inside, I was unraveling every interaction, mapping every behavior, measuring every risk. The horror wasn't just what he had done. It was how easily he could continue doing it if I moved too quickly. He knew me, my habits, my tells, my fears, and he believed I was unconscious to the truth. That belief was dangerous, but it was also my only advantage. I began to understand that this was not about violence in the way people usually imagine it. There were no bruises to photograph, no broken furniture, no neighbors to call. The harm lived in the erosion of my autonomy, in the quiet theft of my awareness. How do you explain that to someone who has never lived it? How do you say, he drugged me into compliance, when the world expects harm to look dramatic? I thought about the countless nights I had surrendered to sleep without consent, about the vulnerability of being unconscious next to someone who saw that unconsciousness as opportunity. About how intimacy had been replaced by access. The bed no longer felt neutral. It felt like a stage where something had been performed without my knowledge. Every sheet, every pillow held an accusation. I struggled with shame then, not because I had done something wrong, but because society teaches women to internalize harm, to ask what we missed, what signs we ignored, what we should have known. I replayed conversations where I had laughed off my own fear, where I had defended him to myself, where I had dismissed the voice inside me that whispered, "Something is wrong." That voice had never been wrong. I had just been trained not to listen to it. The psychological horror deepened as I realized how dependent the system was on my silence. If I spoke too soon, without proof, without strategy, I would be labeled confused, emotional, unstable. The very narrative he had been building would be used against me. He had already laid the groundwork. I noticed how often he mentioned my forgetfulness to others, casually, like a joke. How he positioned himself as patient, long-suffering. How he earned sympathy before it was ever needed. That foresight chilled me. This wasn't impulsive harm. It was long-term control. And control requires planning, consistency, and belief in one's own right to dominate another person's reality. The fear shifted then. It was no longer just about what had been done to me. It was about what could continue if I miscalculated, if I trusted the wrong person, if I revealed myself before I was ready. Every day became a performance layered over surveillance. I observed without reacting. I learned to hide my reactions better than I ever had before. I became fluent in stillness. Inside, my thoughts were relentless. Questions looped without answers. How long? How often? Why? But the most haunting question was how easily it had all blended into something that looked like care. That is the true psychological horror. Not the act itself, but the way it wears the face of love. Survival does not announce itself with bravery. It arrives quietly, like a muscle you didn't know you had tightening on its own. Once the horror settled into something steady and cold, my instincts took over in ways my emotions could not. Fear became information. Every reaction had to be measured. Every movement had to mean something. I understood that the first rule was not to reveal myself. Knowledge without safety is dangerous. I could not let him know that I was awake, not just physically, but mentally. I could not afford the relief of confrontation. Relief is loud. Relief invites mistakes. What I needed was time, so I became careful in a way that felt unnatural at first. I slowed everything down. I listened more than I spoke. I watched my own face in the mirror, practicing neutrality. I paid attention to my tone, my pauses, the way I reacted to his words. I learned which questions raised his attention and which reassured him. I learned how much curiosity he tolerated before it turned into suspicion. Survival taught me restraint. I continued the routine because breaking it too soon would have exposed me. I accepted the pills when he offered them. I let him believe they were working. I let my body play dead when needed. That was not weakness. That was camouflage. I memorized details instead of writing them down. Dates, times, changes in his behavior. I stored them in my mind like fragile glass, careful not to let them clink together. I paid attention to how often he checked on me, how often he left the apartment at night, how his phone never left his side. I noticed which drawers were locked, which were not, which conversations ended abruptly when I entered the room. Every small observation became a thread. I didn't know yet how they would connect, but I trusted that they would. I began to rebuild myself quietly, not emotionally, practically. I ate more during the day to counter the weakness that came from disrupted sleep. I rested when I could strategically so that my exhaustion wouldn't betray me. I practiced staying awake at night without the pills, learning how long my body could hold out, how to manage the urge to surrender. There were moments when panic threatened to undo everything. Moments when my chest tightened and my vision narrowed. In those moments, I grounded myself in details, the feel of the floor under my feet, the weight of my breath, the sound of my own name in my head. Panic passes if you don't give it your voice. I began to understand that survival is not just about escape. It is about endurance, about lasting long enough to choose the right moment. I had to accept that the safest move might be no move at all, at least for now. I reached outward in small, invisible ways. A longer conversation with a neighbor. A casual check-in with someone I hadn't spoken to in a while. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that could be traced back to urgency. Just threads reconnecting, quietly. I watched how he reacted when I showed small signs of independence, when I suggested going out alone, when I delayed responding to his messages, when I expressed a preference that didn't align with his expectations. Each reaction taught me something. Each taught me where the edges were. Survival sharpened my patience. I stopped looking for reassurance from him. I stopped seeking comfort in the place that had become unsafe. That was harder than any physical restraint. It meant sitting with my fear alone, not reaching for the person who had once been my refuge. It meant grieving silently while acting normal. There were nights when I lay awake, not pretending this time, and felt the weight of the waiting press down on me. Waiting is exhausting. Waiting without certainty is worse. But I reminded myself that I was no longer powerless. I was informed, I was aware. Awareness is not freedom, but it is the path toward it. I practiced imagining different outcomes. Not fantasies of rescue, but realistic possibilities. What if I left suddenly? What if I waited longer? What if I asked for help? What if I stayed silent too long? I didn't commit to any of them yet. I let them exist as options, not promises. My instincts told me when to stay still and when to move. I listened to them now, without argument. They had been right before. They were right now. I began to separate my internal life from my external one. Inside, I was alert, calculating, preparing. Outside, I was compliant, predictable, unremarkable. That split was painful, but it was also protective. It gave me space to think without interference. I noticed how often he underestimated me, how easily he assumed that my quiet meant ignorance. That assumption became my shield. I learned to forgive myself for what I hadn't known before. Survival required that too. Guilt wastes energy. Shame slows you down. I needed all of myself intact. The instinct to live does not care about pride or appearances. It cares about timing, about probability, about reducing risk. It told me to breathe, to wait, to watch, to prepare without rushing toward an ending I couldn't yet secure. Every day I stayed deliberately. Not because I was trapped, but because I was choosing the conditions of my leaving. That distinction mattered. It kept me from collapsing inward. I no longer asked why this had happened. Why invites helplessness? I focused on how to outlast it. Survival became a quiet discipline. Wake up, observe, adapt, protect, repeat. And somewhere beneath the fear, beneath the vigilance, there was something else growing. Not hope. Not yet. Something steadier. A resolve that did not need to be loud to be real. A knowledge that as long as I remained conscious, as long as I remained present in my own mind, I had not been defeated. I carried that knowledge with me through the days and nights, letting it guide my steps, my silences, my patience, trusting that the instinct that had kept me alive this far would know when the waiting had done its work. The turning point did not arrive with a confrontation. It did not come with raised voices or sudden courage. It came disguised as a mistake. His mistake, small enough to overlook, large enough to change everything. By then, I had learned how to wait. Waiting had become my skill. I moved through the days with a calm that was carefully constructed, my reactions measured, my questions rare. I let him believe the routine had reclaimed me. I let him believe the pills still worked the way they always had. I let him believe that my world remained small and soft and easily managed. And because he believed that, he grew careless. Carelessness doesn't look dramatic. It looks like confidence. Like someone who assumes they are no longer being watched. Like someone who thinks the danger has passed because the threat never announced itself. It began with a phone call he took too close to me. He had always been careful to step away, to lower his voice, to create distance. That day, he didn't. He stood near the window, his back half turned, his voice hushed but not enough. I caught fragments, names I didn't recognize, a tone I had never heard him use with anyone before, not affectionate, not angry, transactional. My body reacted before my mind caught up. A tightening. A sharpening, the instinct that had saved me before stirred again. He glanced at me once while he spoke, quickly, automatically, and looked away just as fast. That glance told me everything I needed to know. He was checking, not out of care, but out of habit. Checking to see if I was still safely unaware. I kept my face neutral. I kept my movements slow. Inside, something clicked into place. Later that night, he deviated from the routine. Not much, just enough. He handed me the pills without the water already poured. Such a small change, but patterns matter when your life depends on them. I watched his hands. I watched his eyes. I noted the difference. That was when I realized how much of his control relied on precision, on repetition, on predictability. And that meant that disruption, even a small one, could ripple. The next day, I found something I wasn't meant to see. Not because he had hidden it poorly, but because he had grown used to not being questioned. A receipt tucked into a drawer he no longer checked carefully. A date that didn't match his explanations. A name I recognized from the phone call. Proof doesn't always look like a confession. Sometimes it looks like alignment. Pieces falling into a shape you didn't want to see but can no longer deny. I didn't react. I didn't confront him. I didn't even allow myself the luxury of anger. Anger is impulsive. What I felt instead was focus. I began to understand that his power over me depended on one thing above all others, my perceived helplessness. As long as he believed I was unaware, disoriented, dependent, he felt secure. That security was the opening. I tested the edges carefully. I asked a question I had never asked before, framed casually, as if it were nothing more than curiosity. He answered too quickly. His response rehearsed. That told me he had thought about the possibility long before I ever voiced it. I mentioned seeing a doctor again. Alone, his reaction was subtle but immediate. A tightening around the eyes, a shift in tone. Concern wrapped around control. He suggested waiting, suggested he come with me, suggested alternatives. That resistance confirmed what I already knew. The turning point was not just the discovery of his deception. It was the realization that I no longer needed him to reveal himself. He already had, in fragments, in patterns, in slips. I stopped seeing him as someone I needed to understand. I began seeing him as someone I needed to outmaneuver. That shift was profound. It changed how I thought, how I planned, how I moved through the space we shared. I was no longer trapped in confusion. I was operating with intent. I prepared quietly. I gathered what I could without raising suspicion. I memorized information. I made copies only when I was certain they would not be noticed. I built contingencies in my mind, rehearsing different paths, different outcomes. There was a moment, brief but decisive, when I realized I was no longer afraid of him in the same way. Fear had been replaced by something steadier, not confidence, readiness. He made one final mistake. He underestimated time. He believed that whatever he was doing could continue indefinitely. He believed my silence meant surrender. That belief gave me room. One evening, when he assumed I would be asleep, I stayed awake without pretending. I stayed awake because I no longer needed to witness. I already knew enough. What I needed now was opportunity. Opportunity does not announce itself either. It arrives as a gap. A moment when control loosens just enough. A moment when routine falters. I took it, not dramatically, not suddenly, carefully, with the same patience that had kept me alive. Every step calculated. Every decision grounded in observation rather than emotion. The turning point was not the act itself. It was the internal shift that made the act possible. The moment when I stopped asking if I was allowed to protect myself and started acting as if my survival did not require permission. That change did not feel triumphant. It felt sober, clear, heavy with consequence. I understood then that there would be no clean ending. No moment where everything made sense. But I also understood that I had crossed a line he never expected me to cross. From that point on, the balance had shifted. He was still confident, still calm, still unaware. But I was no longer the one in the dark. The aftermath did not arrive all at once. It came in layers, uneven and disorienting, like waking up in a place that looked familiar but no longer felt safe. Even after I was no longer under his roof, even after the pills were gone from my nights, my body behaved as if nothing had changed. Sleep came in fragments. Silence felt loud. Every sound carried weight. Freedom did not feel like relief. It felt like exposure. I had imagined that once I stepped away, the truth would rise cleanly to the surface, that clarity would replace confusion. Instead, the truth stayed fractured, incomplete. There were gaps I could not fill, memories that refused to return, nights that existed only as sensations rather than images. My mind protected me by withholding details, and at the same time punished me by leaving questions unanswered. People think survival ends when danger ends. They do not understand that survival simply changes shape. I moved through days carefully, as if the world itself might slip something into my hands without my noticing. I checked labels obsessively. I hesitated before accepting anything offered with too much insistence. Trust had become a calculation rather than a feeling. There were moments when I doubted myself, when the absence of proof felt heavier than the presence of fear, when I wondered if I had imagined parts of it, exaggerated others, misread intentions. Gaslighting does not end when the gaslighter is gone. It echoes. It lingers. It asks its questions in your own voice. I replayed small details over and over. His tone. His pauses, the way he watched instead of listened. I searched for something definitive, some final piece that would make the story complete, but completeness never arrived. What I had was fragments. Enough to know I was not safe, not enough to explain everything. And that was the unfinished truth, that some experiences do not come with explanations. They come with consequences. My body remembered things my mind could not articulate. Sudden nausea at night. A tightening in my chest when rooms grew too quiet. A reflexive stillness when footsteps approached. Trauma does not need narrative coherence to exist. It lives in reactions, not sentences. I tried to speak about it once, just once. The words came out wrong, too soft, too uncertain. The listener's face shifted, sympathy mixing with discomfort. They wanted a clearer story, a villain they could recognize, a timeline they could follow. I could offer none of that cleanly, so I learned to stop talking. Silence returned, but it was no longer imposed. It was chosen, not because I wanted to protect him, but because I was still learning how to protect myself. There were days when anger surfaced unexpectedly, sharp and sudden, not at him alone, but at myself, for trusting, for complying, for not noticing sooner. Self-blame is seductive. It offers the illusion of control. If it was my fault, then maybe I could have prevented it. It took time to understand that responsibility and causation are not the same thing. Even so, the questions persisted. How long had it been happening? What had he gained? What had he planned? Whether there were others who knew, whether I was meant to disappear slowly rather than escape. Those questions had no answers, and they followed me like shadows. I learned that healing does not move forward in a straight line. It circles, it revisits, it doubles back. Some days felt ordinary enough to forget what had happened. Other days collapsed under the weight of it without warning. I began to recognize the cost of what he had taken. Not just time or safety, but something less tangible, a sense of certainty, a belief in my own perceptions. That loss was harder to name and harder to recover. People around me spoke of moving on, of closure, of letting go. They meant well. They always do. But closure assumes that something has ended cleanly. What I carried was unresolved, still breathing, still unfinished. I stopped expecting justice to look like recognition, or apology, or understanding. Sometimes survival itself is the only outcome available. The truth remained partial. I knew enough to know I was harmed, enough to know I had been betrayed, enough to know that what happened was real, even if I could not reconstruct it fully. And that knowledge had to be enough. I learned to live with unanswered questions. To accept that some stories do not conclude. They simply quiet down. They fade into the background noise of a life rebuilt around caution and resilience. At night, when sleep finally came, it was lighter, more fragile, but it was mine, no longer manufactured, no longer stolen. The aftermath did not offer clarity. It offered endurance. It required patience with my own limits, compassion for my confusion, and a willingness to exist without certainty. The truth remained unfinished, not because it lacked importance, but because it no longer needed resolution to validate my experience. What mattered was not what I could prove, but what I survived. And even now, there are moments when I pause, mid-thought, mid-breath, sensing that there is still something I do not know, something that never fully surfaced, something that stayed hidden even from me, lingering just beyond reach, unnamed, unresolved, and quietly present in the spaces between what I remember and what I will never be able to recover. The emotional core of my story is not the act itself, nor even the details of what was done. It is the slow erosion of trust, the quiet theft of autonomy, and the way a person can disappear within their own life without a single visible blow. That is where the weight rests, in the space between presence and erasure, between awareness and helplessness. That is where the human heart learns its deepest lessons, not through outward events, but through intimate, internal reckonings. I remember the first time I noticed that my reactions were no longer my own. A comment he made casually, one I had dismissed 100 times before, suddenly made my stomach twist. I realized I had stopped noticing how I felt, how I moved, how I responded. I was performing, unconsciously, for his comfort, for his approval, for the illusion of harmony. That performance became the thread from which the rest of my emotional life unraveled. The theme is not dramatized in moments of fury or confrontation. It lives in the quiet, the pause before I speak, the tension in my shoulders when he enters a room, the careful monitoring of breath and posture. These small acts, repeated over years, teach the body and mind to survive, but they also shape identity. The self becomes a reflection of caution, of learned compliance, of fear masked as calm. Trust, once fractured, leaves a residue that is heavier than anger. Anger is immediate, loud, and fleeting. Trust broken is invisible, creeping, and omnipresent. I could no longer assume that kindness was genuine, that attention was benign, or that silence was neutral. Every gesture carried a hidden meaning. Every word had to be evaluated, filtered, measured. I learned to read beneath the surface, to notice the subtext, the patterns, the pauses. The emotional core of my experience is the heightened awareness that comes at the cost of peace. Pain has many faces. Some are dramatic, some are hidden. The pain I lived with was quiet. It was internal. It was a constant reminder that my reality could be altered without my consent, without my knowledge, without the world noticing. That invisibility is its own kind of horror. It teaches humility, yes, but also caution, distrust, and vigilance. I carry the lesson everywhere. It is stitched into my nerves, my reactions, my thoughts. Resilience is part of the theme, but it is not triumphant. Resilience is survival's quieter sibling. It is the slow rebuilding of identity in fragments, the careful reclaiming of agency in increments so small that the outside world may never recognize them. Resilience does not erase memory. It does not create closure. It does not promise relief. It simply allows one to continue existing with awareness intact. Memory, in this context, is selective and protective. The mind hides things that are too sharp, too painful, too destabilizing, but the heart does not forget. Every fear, every hesitation, every tiny loss of confidence is stored somewhere in the body. The emotional core lives there, in the chest that tightens at unexpected sounds, in the eyes that scan before trusting, in the voice that hesitates before speaking truth. The theme of this experience is also about the paradox of intimacy and vulnerability. The person who should have been the source of safety became the source of threat. That inversion forces a reevaluation of self, of love, of the meaning of connection. How do you reconcile a heart that seeks closeness with a memory of betrayal? How do you continue to feel and to care when the safe space has been violated repeatedly? That tension forms the emotional spine of my story. Loneliness is intertwined with this emotional core. Not the simple loneliness of physical isolation, but the layered loneliness of mistrust, of internalized doubt, of awareness that one is navigating danger that others may never recognize. Loneliness becomes both shield and burden. It isolates, yes, but it also allows the mind to process, to strategize, to survive. In this solitude, I learned to listen to myself in ways I never had before. I learned to trust fragments of intuition that had been suppressed. Fear, in this context, is a teacher. Not the fear of violence alone, but the fear of erasure, the fear of being unseen in one's own life, the fear of losing mental and emotional agency. It sharpens perception. It forces attention to detail. It awakens instincts long dormant. Yet fear is heavy, exhausting. It presses down on the chest, clogs the throat, clouds sleep. Living under its weight teaches endurance, patience, and vigilance, but it also leaves scars that do not heal visibly. The emotional core also includes the recognition of small victories, though they are subtle. Not a dramatic confrontation or a loud declaration, but moments when agency is reclaimed, deciding without consulting, speaking without hesitation, resisting without exposure. These victories are quiet but profound. They are the markers of internal reclaiming, the seeds of the person I continue to rebuild. Hope exists in this theme, but it is tempered and cautious. It is not the naive hope of fairy tales. It is a deliberate hope, that awareness can guide action, that knowledge can prevent further harm, that the self can survive and even thrive under careful conditions. This hope is intertwined with pain, because each memory reminds me how easily control can be lost, how fragile autonomy can be when trust has been weaponized. Finally, the emotional core is about truth, the truth of lived experience, not the truth that can be measured or documented or neatly summarized. It is about embracing the incomplete, the fractured, the unresolved, and finding the strength to exist anyway. The weight of this truth is immense, but it is also grounding. It teaches endurance, vigilance, empathy for oneself, and a recognition of the resilience embedded in human spirit when faced with manipulation and betrayal. This is the heart of the story, the quiet, unrelenting, deeply human experience of living through control, deception, and betrayal, of reclaiming fragments of agency, and of existing with the knowledge that survival is ongoing and truth is often unfinished, yet profoundly real. The ending did not arrive with fanfare. There was no dramatic confrontation, no declaration of victory, no sudden unraveling of what had been years in the making. The ending, as I came to understand it, was not a conclusion at all. It was a subtle shift, an internal settling, a quiet acknowledgement of what had been lost, what had been survived, and what remained to be reclaimed. I sat in my space, the apartment I now called my own, and I noticed the silence. Not the silence that had been forced upon me, heavy and suffocating, but a quiet that belonged to no one else. It was mine. It felt fragile, delicate, as though any sudden noise could shatter it. Yet it was comforting in a way that fear had never allowed. This silence was not empty, it was full of potential. It was full of the space I had fought to preserve, the space I had trained my body and mind to protect for years. I reflected on the nights I had spent pretending to sleep, listening to him move through the apartment, the calculated carefulness of every step, the precision with which he maintained his control. Those nights had taught me patience in a form that cannot be taught by books or lessons. They had taught me how to observe without being seen, to learn without exposing oneself, to prepare without revealing intent. Now, in the aftermath, I could recognize those lessons as tools, not chains. They were mine to keep. Even as I moved freely, I remained aware. Awareness had become a part of me, inseparable from the rhythm of my life. I knew that the world did not pause because I survived. Danger could return in many forms, in subtle shifts, in quiet intrusions. I understood that survival is not simply about leaving, it is about sustaining oneself continuously, with vigilance that never fully sleeps. That realization brought no relief, but it brought clarity. The days unfolded with ordinary routines, making meals, arranging my space, reading, walking in the sunlight. On the surface, life appeared calm. Yet beneath, my mind traced patterns, measured possibilities, and prepared silently. This was not fear in its purest form, but an internalized caution, a map etched into my body by years of conditioning. I had learned the rhythms of my own responses, the triggers of my anxiety, the points where my patience could be stretched without breaking. In understanding myself, I had begun to reclaim authority over my own existence. Memories surfaced unpredictably. Small fragments that carried sharp edges, the tilt of his head when he watched me take the pills, the slight hesitation in his voice when he answered questions, the subtle repositioning of objects in the room to assert control. Each memory was a puzzle piece, forming an image that was painful to hold, yet necessary to remember. I realized that memory is both a burden and a tool. It reminds us of what was endured, but it also guides the decisions we make moving forward. I no longer relied on external validation for my existence. Where once I had sought reassurance from others, neighbors, friends, even distant relatives, I now trusted the compass of my own perception. I recognized that those who had not lived through what I could not fully comprehend it, and that seeking understanding from them was not always necessary. My internal validation became my anchor. It was a steady force in the shifting currents of life. Time passed differently after that. The days were neither filled with joy nor with despair, but with the quiet intensity of living deliberately. Every decision became intentional, measured, weighted. I understood that freedom does not absolve one from vigilance. That freedom is not an endpoint. It is an ongoing negotiation between the self and the world. The ending, then, is not about resolution. It is about the continuation of conscious survival. I began to appreciate the smallest of details. The way sunlight hit the floor in the morning, the sound of birds outside the window, the taste of water that was mine to drink without question. These seemingly mundane sensations became markers of existence reclaimed, of control restored over my own body and environment. Each one was a quiet celebration of autonomy. Even as the external world continued with its indifference, I discovered an inner language of resilience. My heart carried the echoes of trauma, yes, but also the rhythms of endurance. I learned to speak to myself gently, to remind myself of my own worth, to recognize the victories that no one else would ever notice. Survival had reshaped me into someone who could endure horrors without being erased, who could navigate shadows without being consumed by them. There were moments when grief returned, unbidden. A fragment of memory, a familiar sound, a fleeting gesture in someone else would trigger it. I did not fight these moments. I allowed them to wash over me, to remind me that I had lived through what was meant to erase me, and yet I remained intact. Grief, in this context, became a form of acknowledgement, of pain survived, of agency reclaimed, of humanity preserved. The ending was not about revenge, retribution, or justice. Those are outcomes dictated by others, by systems, by chance. My ending was about inhabiting my own life fully, in its complexity, in its ambiguity, in its unshakable continuity. It was about understanding that even when truth remains unfinished, when resolution is partial or absent, the self can still endure and reclaim its dignity. I noticed the quiet strength that had always been there, buried under layers of fear, under years of obedience, under the manipulation that had taught me to doubt my own senses. That strength was patient, waiting for the moment when it could emerge fully. It was a force neither dramatic nor loud, but steady and unyielding. It did not seek acknowledgement because it needed none. It existed simply because I did. And so I lived each day aware of the fragility and resilience intertwined within me. Aware that the world carries dangers unseen, that people harbor intentions hidden, that control can be subtle, insidious, and long-lasting. yet also aware that I had endured, adapted, and reclaimed fragments of self that had once been threatened. The ending, in this sense, is the continuation of vigilance, the persistence of consciousness, the cultivation of internal autonomy. Even now, as I navigate life, the shadows of what I endured are present, shaping my awareness, tempering my choices, sharpening my instincts. The external calm masks an internal landscape of careful observation, deliberate movement, and measured response. This ending is not closure. It is a state of ongoing existence, watchful, prepared, steady. It is the recognition that the story does not require an endpoint to hold meaning. That survival itself is a form of narrative. That endurance is an expression of truth. That living fully, consciously, and intentionally in the aftermath of harm is the most profound act of reclamation. This ending, therefore, is layered with complexity. It is sorrowful yet steady, haunted yet aware, reflective yet active. It carries all the weight of the experiences that shaped it and all the possibility of the life that continues beyond them. It is not neat. It is not tidy. It is lived, and that is enough to mark its significance. Sometimes it looks like love until you notice how powerless you feel inside it. The suspicion settled into me like a second heartbeat. Quiet, persistent, unignorable.